Welcome to Karma's Ledger, where every choice leaves its trace. Tonight's story follows Evelyn Price, a nurse who once turned away from love when it mattered most. In the sterile halls of a hospital that never forgets, she'll learn that neglect, too, has a heartbeat. Stay with us through this haunting tale of mercy, memory, and the scent of lavender that lingers where guilt once lived. Subscribe and like for more stories where karma writes the final chapter. When head nurse Evelyn Price walked into room 12, she didn't expect to meet a woman who knew the scent of her mother's perfume, or the guilt buried under her pressed uniform. What began as another long night shift would soon become a reckoning written in IV drips and whispered prayers. Subscribe and like for more stories from Karma's Ledger, where every act finds its echo. Evelyn Price had worked 23 years under the sterile hum of hospital lights, long enough for the rhythm of beeping monitors to replace the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She moved through the corridors like a ghost in white, efficient, untouchable, admired by doctors and feared by new nurses who never saw her smile. Rules were her scripture. Compassion, a weakness she'd buried years ago beside a grave that still whispered in her dreams. Her mother's grave. The old woman had begged Evelyn to stay home that last night, said she didn't need medicine, just company, but Evelyn had chosen her shift instead, the one decision that turned every future kindness into penance. Now, the nurses who worked under her spoke of her precision with awe, unaware that it was guilt, not discipline, that kept her upright. On a rainy Thursday near midnight, the ER received a new patient, female, late 60s, cardiac distress, no identification, found collapsed outside a church. Evelyn took the chart out of habit, scanning vitals, but paused when she reached the notes. Patient murmuring phrases about forgiveness. There was something in those words, something that scraped at her calm. When she entered room 12, the woman was already looking at her, eyes soft but knowing, like she'd been waiting. Her face was unfamiliar, but the perfume in the air, lavender, with a trace of rose oil, sent Evelyn back decades to the night her mother's hand had gone cold. "Evening, Mrs." Evelyn began, but the woman smiled faintly. "Names don't matter here, dear. What matters is who remembers." The tone was gentle, almost maternal, and it unsettled her more than any cardiac alarm. Evelyn adjusted the IV, deflecting. "You need rest. Save your strength." "Strength is for those who still have choices," the woman replied. "Do you?" For a heartbeat, Evelyn forgot how to breathe. She dismissed the comment, charted vitals, and left quickly, pretending her pulse wasn't racing. By morning, room 12's patient had stabilized, but no relatives appeared. No ID matched her description. The staff began calling her Jane Doe, yet each nurse who tended her spoke afterward of dreams, odd, vivid dreams about their own families, regrets they thought forgotten. Evelyn brushed it off as stress until she caught herself lingering by the door each night, watching the woman sleep. She told herself it was medical vigilance, but in truth, she was listening. The patient whispered in her sleep, not random phrases, but sentences that sounded eerily familiar. "Don't work tonight, Evie. Sit with me a while." Evelyn froze the first time she heard it. Evie. No one had called her that since her mother died. She tried to rationalize. Coincidence? Auditory fatigue? But part of her mind began unraveling, thread by thread. 3 days later, the woman woke during dawn rounds. Her eyes followed Evelyn like light follows glass. "How long will you keep punishing yourself?" she asked softly. Evelyn's pen dropped. "Excuse me?" "You treat everyone else's wounds except your own. You think medicine can mend what mercy never touched." The nurse's composure cracked. "You're confused. I'll send the psychiatrist." But the patient only smiled again, that same motherly curve of lips. "I've already seen him. Years ago. When you wouldn't go." Evelyn fled the room. In the break area, she poured black coffee into a paper cup that trembled in her hand. Memories pressed against her ribs, the night her mother had coughed blood into a handkerchief, while Evelyn logged overtime, the phone call from the neighbor that came too late, the lavender scent that clung to the bedsheets when she'd gone home to pack up the house. She had promised herself to forget, to bury softness under protocol. Yet now a stranger in room 12 was speaking in the language of ghosts. That evening, while reviewing medication charts, Evelyn noticed an anomaly. The patient in room 12 hadn't received her cardiac meds since morning, yet her vitals were improving. No nurse claimed responsibility. Curious and unnerved, Evelyn went to see for herself. The room was dim, lit only by the monitor's pulse glow. The woman was sitting upright, humming a lullaby Evelyn half remembered. "You shouldn't be awake," Evelyn said, her voice lower than intended. "Neither should you," the woman answered. "Not until you forgive yourself." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "Someone who remembers what it means to care." The nurse's throat tightened. "You're not real." "Then why do you cry like a child who just heard her mother's voice?" Evelyn turned away, but tears had already blurred the sterile edges of the room. That night, she dreamed she was back in her childhood home. The kitchen light flickered, the table smelled of lavender polish. Her mother sat across from her, alive, younger, eyes gentle. "You thought duty was love," the dream mother said. "But love doesn't clock in and out." Evelyn reached across the table, but her hand passed through air. She woke gasping, the monitor in room 12 echoing in her head. When she returned to work the next morning, she found the bed empty. Panic flared. The nurse on duty said a transfer order had come through. ICU, though no one could locate the paperwork. Evelyn searched every floor, every chart, but room 12 had already been cleaned for the next patient. Only one thing remained. A folded note on the bedside tray, smelling faintly of lavender. Inside, in looping handwriting she hadn't seen in 20 years, were 4 words. "You finally stayed home." Evelyn sank into the chair, paper shaking in her hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her mother's, from old recipe cards and birthday notes. Her rational mind rebelled. Maybe an old family member of a patient had written it. Maybe coincidence again. Yet the truth hummed deeper. That evening, she did something she hadn't done since her mother's funeral. She went off shift early. She drove to her mother's grave in the small cemetery outside town. Rain softened the soil. The lavender she'd planted there had spread wild. She knelt, breathing in the scent. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought saving others would save me too." A gust of wind moved through the trees, gentle as breath. For the first time, Evelyn let herself cry, not the quiet, professional tears of a nurse, but the messy, human ones of a daughter. The following week, Evelyn returned to the hospital different. Her stride was slower, her tone less sharp. The junior nurses noticed, unsure if it was fatigue or grace. When a new trainee dropped an IV tray, Evelyn helped her pick it up instead of scolding. She even smiled once, awkward, genuine. Word spread that the iron nurse had softened. Some said burnout, others said enlightenment. Only Evelyn knew the truth. Room 12 had been more than a room. It had been a mirror. In its reflection, she'd finally met the version of herself who could forgive. Late one night, while updating patient files, she found a new admission slip that made her blood run cold. Patient name: Jane Doe. Condition: cardiac distress. Room assignment: 12. She blinked. That room number had been retired after renovations. When she went to check, the hallway lights flickered and the door stood half open. Inside, the bed was neatly made, the air faintly scented with lavender. On the pillow lay a single white nurse's pin, the kind her mother used to wear before arthritis took her hands. Evelyn stood there for a long time, pulse steady, heart lighter. She pinned it to her uniform before walking back to her rounds. The beeping monitors sounded softer now, like distant lullabies instead of alarms. From that night on, the hospital staff said room 12 carried a calm unlike any other ward. Patients there recovered faster. Nurses felt strangely peaceful. Evelyn never spoke of it again. She only started a small ritual. Before every shift, she'd stop by the nurses' station, place a sprig of lavender in a jar, and whisper, "For the ones we forgot." The act spread quietly through the staff. Soon, every nurse kept a little flower by their station, a reminder that care without heart is only half a cure. And though no one could explain why, the hospital's air always seemed a bit warmer near room 12, like forgiveness itself had decided to stay. Evelyn Price thought she had closed that chapter of her life, sealed it neatly under professionalism and paperwork. But the strange calm that followed her encounter with room 12 began to ripple through her days like an unseen current. There were moments when she would pause in the corridor and swear she heard humming, the same lullaby that patient had sung in the dim light. The hospital had many sounds: ventilators, monitors, call bells, the distant drone of gossip between shifts. But this was different. It was softer, too intentional to be mistaken for coincidence. She never mentioned it aloud, knowing how stories traveled in hospitals faster than infection. Instead, she let the quiet haunt her, like a question she wasn't ready to ask. One evening, a week into the new month, Evelyn was assigned to the night shift again. Her team was thin. Flu season had swept through the staff, leaving her with two new hires barely out of orientation. Around midnight, as rain lashed against the glass, she began her rounds, each room a soft glow of machinery and dreams. When she reached the end of the hall, she paused before what used to be room 12. The plaque had been replaced with maintenance storage, but the air near that door still smelled faintly of lavender. "You're not real," she whispered to no one, though her own voice betrayed the wish that it was. Halfway through the shift, the intercom buzzed. "Code Blue, Room 7. Evelyn ran, instincts taking over. A man in his 50s lay pale and gasping, monitors blaring. She barked orders, worked the defibrillator, compressed until sweat soaked her scrubs. Finally, the heart monitor steadied, flat chaos returning to rhythm. When the patient was stabilized and transferred to ICU, she stood alone for a moment, catching her breath. Her hands trembled. Not from exhaustion, but from something stranger. When she'd pressed down on his chest, she'd felt something cold beneath her palm. Metal, like a pin. Later, when she washed her hands, she found a small indentation in her skin where the metal had pressed. The shape was round, familiar, just like the pin she now wore. After the incident, she sat in the empty cafeteria, sipping stale coffee, trying to rationalize what she'd felt. Maybe the man had a necklace, she told herself. Maybe the mind, under stress, invented patterns. Yet part of her couldn't shake the thought that the hospital itself was responding to her in ways logic couldn't chart. A few nights later, a nurse named Riley approached her nervously. "Ma'am, can I ask something strange?" Evelyn nodded. "It's about that storage room at the end. I was walking by and heard humming, like someone inside." Evelyn's spine stiffened. "Could be the air vents," she offered, too quickly. Riley hesitated. "It was a song. Something old. I don't know. Kind of peaceful." Evelyn said nothing, only told her to finish rounds and not mention it again. But that night, after everyone left, she found herself standing before the locked door. The janitor's keys hung at her waist. Against her better judgment, she unlocked it. The room was dark, lined with mops and old equipment. Nothing unusual, until she noticed the faint light leaking from behind a shelf. She moved it aside. There, half hidden beneath dust, stood a forgotten patient bed, Tag faded but legible. 12A. The sight pulled the breath from her chest. The mattress was spotless. On it lay a folded note. Same looping, handwriting. You still hear me? Evelyn dropped the paper. The humming grew louder for a heartbeat, then faded into silence. She locked the door and walked away without looking back, but something followed her, an awareness, as if the walls themselves were watching. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's demeanor began to change in ways that unsettled even her. She started noticing small miracles, wounds healing faster than expected, anxious patients sleeping through the night, tempers softening in places where tension usually thrived. The younger nurses credited her new leadership style, but she knew better. The lavender scent now lingered through multiple wards, sometimes faint, sometimes unmistakable. It wasn't just room 12 anymore. One morning, a patient she'd never met grabbed her hand and whispered, "She says thank you." Evelyn froze. "Who?" The patient smiled weakly. "The lady with the kind voice. She said you finally learned the right medicine." Before she could ask more, the patient drifted back to sleep. Evelyn left the room with her pulse hammering. She began carrying a small vial of lavender oil in her pocket, not out of sentiment, but as if acknowledging it might somehow contain the boundary between sanity and something else. She started seeing meaning in coincidences, but also peace. It was as if, by facing her guilt, she'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. Yet what came through wasn't punishment. It was guidance. Then came the night everything deepened. A massive power outage hit during a thunderstorm. Backup generators failed for 3 minutes, an eternity in a hospital. Evelyn led the emergency response, checking critical patients, directing manual ventilations. Amid the chaos, she turned a corner and saw a dim light down the supposedly empty corridor, the one ending at the maintenance room. Against instinct, she went toward it. The door was ajar. Inside, she found not storage, not dust, but a fully lit hospital room, pristine, humming softly with the glow of machinery. On the bed lay a woman in white. Not the frail older patient she remembered, but younger, stronger, eyes open and alive. "You came back," the woman said, voice both familiar and distant. "You always come back." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. "What are you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "A memory made mercy," the woman replied. "You once treated medicine as penance. Now you're learning it can be prayer." Evelyn took a hesitant step closer. "Why me?" "Because you listened." The machines blinked once, then flickered out. The lights died again, plunging the room into darkness. When they returned, the bed was empty. Only the lavender scent remained. When the power stabilized, no one else had seen the light, or the woman. But in the system logs, room 12 had reappeared on the floor plan, just for 3 minutes, time-stamped to the outage. Maintenance swore it was a glitch. Evelyn knew better. She didn't tell anyone. She just kept working. Quieter now, her presence softer, but unshakably calm. Patients sought her out, saying her touch made them feel seen. New nurses began calling her Mother Evelyn, half in jest, half in awe. She didn't correct them. At the end of each shift, she would pass the old corridor and whisper, "Thank you for staying." Some nights, when the hospital was too still, she would almost hear the reply, "Thank you for coming home." Over the following months, Evelyn started volunteering at hospice wards, places where medicine gave way to acceptance. There, she met families torn by guilt, regrets, unfinished apologies. She never preached, never mentioned ghosts or lavender. She just listened. Sometimes that was enough to ease a dying breath. Karma, she realized, wasn't punishment. It was conversation. A long, looping one that waited patiently for you to speak honestly. One afternoon, she received a letter forwarded to her by administration. No return address, only a note inside, written in that same graceful hand. Every nurse heals twice. Once for others, once for themselves. Keep both alive. She folded it carefully and placed it beside her badge. Years later, after Evelyn retired, new management renovated the East Wing entirely. The old floor plan was replaced, the rooms renumbered. But when the construction team reached the space between room 11 and the new supply closet, their instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun, lights dimmed. One worker reported hearing humming. They sealed the wall and moved on. The official records listed no room 12, no bed tagged 12A. But every few months, a nurse on the night shift would stop by that hallway, inhale the faint scent of lavender, and swear they heard a woman's voice say, "Rest easy, Evie. You finally learned the right medicine." And somewhere, beyond the noise of machines and memory, the echo of her forgiveness kept the ward gentle. Proof that not every haunting is cruel. Some simply refuse to leave until they've seen you heal. The change in Evelyn Price began quietly enough to pass for coincidence, the way spring creeps into the edges of winter without asking permission. It started with her patients, how wounds seemed to close cleaner, how fevers broke faster, how those near the edge often lingered just long enough to say what needed saying. The doctors noticed her record, but chalked it up to experience, to that sharp, near-clinical intuition nurses earned after decades in the field. But her colleagues knew better. They began calling it the lavender effect, a whispered phrase that floated through night shifts, half joke, half reverence. No one could define it, only feel it. Evelyn didn't correct them. She just worked. She came early, stayed late, and carried herself like someone who'd finally made peace with the ghosts in her reflection. Yet deep down, she sensed that peace wasn't the end of the story. It was a beginning, disguised as calm. One night, while making her rounds in the recovery ward, she met a young intern named Dr. Samuel Pierce, new to the hospital, still stiff in his pressed coat and arrogance. He reminded her of herself decades ago, certain that control was the same as care. "You don't need to comfort every patient," he told her with a hint of superiority when she lingered by a dying man's bed. "We're here to treat, not to coddle." Evelyn glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And yet, one day, you'll learn that medicine without mercy is just engineering." He scoffed, but her words stuck to him like a burr. A week later, when one of his patients died unexpectedly, she found him sitting outside the ICU at dawn, head in hands. She didn't lecture him. She simply placed a lavender sprig beside him on the bench and walked away. By morning, he'd written his first condolence note by hand. Word spread that Evelyn was mentoring again, though she never asked for the title. What she did was subtler. She began teaching the younger nurses how to see the human inside the diagnosis. "Don't just record their vitals," she would say. "Listen for what they don't say." Some rolled their eyes at her sentimentality, but many found themselves changed after a few shifts beside her. One nurse, Alicia, had a habit of avoiding palliative cases, afraid of watching patients die. Evelyn paired her with the hospice rotation without warning. When Alicia protested, Evelyn said gently, "You can't call yourself a healer if you're afraid of endings." A month later, Alicia held the hand of her first patient as they passed peacefully in sleep. Afterward, she told Evelyn, through tears, "It wasn't as scary as I thought." Evelyn nodded. "That's because you were there. That's all most people want, to not leave alone." It wasn't just talk. Something about her presence began to calm even the building itself. The ward lights flickered less often near her station. Machines rarely malfunctioned. Even the scent of antiseptic seemed less harsh. Nurses began leaving small lavender flowers at their desks, like offerings, though no one said aloud what they were for. But not everyone welcomed the quiet shift. The new administrator, Ms. Reynolds, a woman with a corporate smile and eyes that counted seconds as money, disliked Evelyn's unrecorded influence. "We can't measure empathy," she said during a staff meeting. "We need data, not superstition." She'd heard whispers about the Lavender Nurse, about stories of patients claiming to see a glowing figure beside their beds at night. If staff is spreading folklore, it reflects poorly on hospital credibility. Evelyn stayed silent during the lecture, her face unreadable. But that night, Reynolds stayed late to finalize budgets. Alone in her office, she began hearing humming. Soft, rhythmic, impossibly close. She searched the room, found nothing. When she opened the file for room allocations, the page glitched, flickered, and a line appeared that shouldn't exist. Room 12. Status active. She blinked, refreshed the screen, and it vanished. The next morning, she avoided Evelyn's eyes. She didn't bring it up again. The lavender effect soon became something larger than gossip. Families started writing letters to administration, thanking the nurse with the calm voice who sat by their relatives at night, even when Evelyn had been assigned elsewhere. Patients described dreams where they saw her, or someone who looked like her, comforting them in silence. It unnerved her, not from fear but from recognition. Whatever energy had awakened in room 12 had grown roots beyond her. It wasn't about her anymore. She was just a bridge. Still, part of her resisted the mystique. She wanted no halo, no legend, only understanding. So, on an off day, she returned to the old East Wing, alone. The maintenance door stood unchanged, paint dull, no label now. She placed her palm against it. "I don't want worship," she whispered, "just clarity." The door was cold, but beneath it she swore she heard faint breathing. Then a voice, not from beyond, but from inside her, answered, "Then keep serving. The story isn't yours to finish." She stepped back, heart steady. She understood. From then on, Evelyn's karma stopped revolving around her guilt and began weaving into others. Her small axe rippled wider. A janitor she once scolded harshly found his estranged daughter, visiting him after years, claiming she had a dream about her father cleaning light instead of dirt. A patient's grieving son, who refused to forgive the drunk driver who'd caused his mother's death, found Evelyn beside him one night. She told him, hate is just grief that forgot how to speak. Weeks later, he volunteered to run a recovery program for alcoholics. Each time Evelyn touched someone's life, something unseen balanced itself, not perfectly, but enough to keep the scales from rusting. Still, she never took credit. She said karma worked like the bloodstream. It just needed a pulse to carry what was meant to circulate. Her final shift came on a late winter evening. Snow fell quietly outside the ward windows, muting the world into stillness. The hospital was understaffed again, as always, and Evelyn volunteered, as always. Around midnight, she received a new admission. Elderly female, late-stage heart failure, unresponsive. When she read the name on the chart, her hand froze. Reynolds, Clara, the administrator. Evelyn hurried to the room. The once proud woman lay frail, breathing shallowly. Her eyes flickered open at Evelyn's touch. "I was wrong," she rasped. "Empathy can't be measured, but it's the only thing that heals." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You found the right medicine, then?" Clara's eyes glistened. "Tell her, thank you." Evelyn frowned. "Tell who?" But the woman had already slipped away, a soft peace settling on her features. On the monitor, the heart line flattened, not harshly, but like a curtain falling at the end of a play. After the paperwork, Evelyn walked the empty corridor toward the east wing one last time. The lights dimmed gently as she passed, one by one, as though the building itself bowed in farewell. When she reached the sealed maintenance door, she laid her nurse's pin against it. "It's done," she whispered. The medicine worked. For a moment, nothing. Then the air filled with lavender. The hum of monitors quieted, replaced by that familiar lullaby. She smiled, closed her eyes, and felt something like a hand rest lightly on her shoulder. Not a ghost's touch, but something older, gentler, final. When she opened her eyes, the hallway was empty, but the plaque beside the door had changed. The engraving now read simply, Room 12, Resting. Months later, after Evelyn's retirement party, her locker was cleaned out. The staff found only her badge, her folded uniform, and a small jar labeled lavender oil. For those who stay. No one knew where she'd gone, though some said they'd seen a woman in white tending to patients in other hospitals across the state, humming softly. Whether true or not, every nurse who heard the tale began carrying lavender with them, not as superstition, but as reminder, to care, to stay present, to listen. And though years passed, every time a nurse comforted a dying patient or forgave themselves for not saving one, the faintest scent of lavender drifted through the air, like karma exhaling through mercy. In the end, the lavender effect wasn't a mystery. It was simply Evelyn Price's lesson finally understood. The best medicine isn't given by hand, it's carried by heart. After Evelyn Price retired, the hospital tried to move on as though nothing mystical had ever happened. The administration renovated, renamed, rebranded. They took down the old plaques, polished the corridors into anonymity. But hospitals, like people, remember what they've healed and what they've hidden. It began with small things. The East Wing's temperature never quite matched the rest of the building, as if it preferred its own climate. Some nights, the new charge nurse, a steady woman named Clara Hastings, would find the corridor light on, even after she'd shut it off. Once she caught the faint hum of a song she'd never learned, but somehow knew by heart. She told herself it was imagination until the first patient spoke of the Lavender Nurse. An elderly man recovering from surgery said she sat beside him when the pain spiked, holding his hand, whispering that he could rest. When Clara checked his monitor logs, the time he described matched a brief power fluctuation. The exact minute the camera outside room 12 blinked off and back on. The security team dismissed it as coincidence, but Clara started carrying a sprig of lavender in her pocket after that. In the staff lounge, stories spread quietly, like infection but kinder. A paramedic swore he saw a woman in white helping stabilize a patient in the ambulance bay during a storm, though no nurse was scheduled there. A cleaner found faint footprints by the old maintenance door, barefoot and dry despite the freshly mopped floor. Maintenance replaced the bulbs 3 times, but one flickered stubbornly, glowing soft purple instead of white. No one touched it again. The new generation of nurses called that section the quiet hall. When tempers rose or grief got loud, they'd walk there for a minute, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that never quite faded. Some swore it steadied their hearts. Clara Hastings grew fascinated but cautious. She was a skeptic by training, the kind of nurse who believed in biology, not blessings. Still, there was something undeniably human in the pattern, the way the stories converged, all describing warmth, comfort, and that same soft humming. One night, after a code that ended badly, she stayed late, restless and heavy with failure. It was nearly dawn when she wandered to the East Wing. The corridor lights dimmed behind her, one by one, until she stood in front of the sealed door. Her badge light blinked red, restricted area. She whispered to herself, "If there's something here, show me." The air shifted. The badge light turned green. The door clicked open. Inside was darkness layered with the faintest purple glow. She stepped in and saw not cleaning supplies, but a single empty hospital bed. On the pillow sat a folded nurse's cap, vintage, embroidered with a name, E. Price. Clara sat in the lone chair by the bed, unsure whether to cry or laugh. I never believed in this, she murmured. The air warmed just slightly. A voice, not from around her, but within her, whispered, "Belief isn't required, only care." The humming began again, wrapping around her like breath. She closed her eyes and felt her pulse slow. When she opened them, dawn was bleeding through the window. The bed was empty again, Cap gone. She left the room, heart unsettled yet oddly at peace. That day, she started treating her patients differently. Not faster, not with more procedure, but with presence. She began to see what Evelyn had seen. That healing wasn't about curing, it was about witnessing. Weeks later, during an all-staff meeting, Clara shared something that changed the hospital's course. "Every chart shows numbers," she said, "but our patients remember faces. Let's measure that instead." She proposed an initiative, 1 hour each week where staff would visit patients, not as professionals, but as people. No notes, no monitors. The program was unofficial at first, just a few volunteers. But soon, it spread through the wards. Patient outcomes improved. Complaints dropped. Nurses who'd once burned out stayed longer, smiling again. Someone suggested calling it the Price Hour, and the name stuck. The administration even sanctioned it, unaware how literal the name was. One late evening, Clara found a letter slipped under her office door. No return address, no explanation. Just lavender scent and neat, looping handwriting. You listened when others measured. That's how hospitals learn to heal themselves. The signature read simply, Evelyn. Clara kept it in her uniform pocket, though she never spoke of it. As months passed, the quiet hall became something of a pilgrimage site for the staff. Nurses left small offerings, lavender, thank you notes, even patient wristbands retired after recovery. The janitors never cleaned them away. A rumor spread that anyone who entered the hall burdened by guilt would leave lighter. Some laughed it off, others swore by it. One night, a new intern named Maya, overwhelmed after her first loss, wandered there in tears. She said later that a woman touched her shoulder and said, "It hurts now because it matters." The security footage showed Maya entering the hall alone, but a second shadow moved beside her, faint and steady, before fading into light. Eventually, the hospital board, pressured by rumors, decided to finally decommission the East Wing. They wanted to demolish it, rebuild into offices. Clara objected but was overruled. The night before demolition, she walked the corridor one last time. The lavender scent was strong, as if concentrated in farewell. She whispered, "If you're still here, I'll keep it alive elsewhere." A gentle hum answered, barely audible. The next morning, before the crew arrived, the entire wing flooded from a burst pipe. No apparent cause, no waterline break found. The damage forced the board to abandon reconstruction. Instead, they turned the space into a small memorial lounge for nurses who'd passed away in service. They named it the Evelyn Room. Visitors said it felt unusually calm inside. Grieving families found comfort there, especially those who'd lost loved ones in the hospital. Over time, the lavender scent returned, faint but constant. The staff stopped questioning it. They just learned to breathe it in. And so Evelyn Price's lesson, the quiet medicine of mercy, became the heartbeat of the hospital itself. Karma had not punished, it had taught. And every nurse who walked that corridor learned the same truth in their own way. What you give from your heart lingers longer than any nameplate. Years after Evelyn Price's name faded from staff rosters, the lavender scent began turning up far from the hospital that once carried her footsteps. It appeared first in the homes of retired nurses, in the rooms where they sat awake at night, wondering if their years of tending, losing, and holding had meant enough. One nurse, Alicia, The same one Evelyn had once pushed toward the hospice ward, found her small apartment filled with that same soft fragrance the night her mother died peacefully in her sleep. She wept, not out of grief, but recognition. Somewhere in the silence, she heard Evelyn's voice saying, "You stayed. That's all love asks." In the morning, Alicia wrote a short letter to the hospital board proposing a new volunteer program for end-of-life care in the community. She called it Lavender Hands. Within months, the idea had spread across the city. The program paired nurses and medical students with patients in their homes, not for treatment, but for presence, companionship, stories, stillness. The impact was immediate and quiet. Families who'd once feared hospitals began trusting them again. Patients who'd refused medication accepted it after feeling seen. It wasn't miracle work, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that left a trace wherever mercy landed. Journalists tried to trace the movement's origin, but every nurse who'd been touched by Evelyn's story told a different version. Some said she was a ghost. Others said she was just a woman who'd finally learned to forgive herself so deeply it changed the air around her. The truth, as always, lived between those two answers. Clara Hastings continued to run the hospital's mentorship program long after her hair turned silver. On her final working day, she visited the Evelyn room. The air smelled of lavender stronger than ever, though no flowers were visible. She sat in the same chair Evelyn once had, placed her hands in her lap and whispered, "You were right. Healing happens in the space between people." A soft hum rose, that familiar lullaby curling through the quiet like a thread. Clara smiled. When she left, she noticed the plaque outside the room had changed again. No longer the Evelyn room. Now it read, "For those who stayed." No one could explain who'd changed it or when. Years turned into decades. The hospital expanded, merged, rebranded twice. Digital systems replaced paper charts, robots took over deliveries, but the nurses still placed lavender sprigs by their stations. Some didn't even know why. It was simply tradition. On the hospital's centennial anniversary, the board held a celebration. Reporters toured the facility, covering advances in technology and patient care. But the most visited exhibit wasn't the robotic wing. It was the Memorial Lounge. Visitors said the air there smelled like comfort, like an old memory you couldn't quite place. One journalist asked an elderly volunteer why. The woman smiled and said, "Because someone once decided guilt could become grace, and grace lingers." By then, Lavender Hands had grown into a national network, with chapters in over 30 states. The logo was a simple outline of two hands cupping a sprig of lavender. Hospitals began reporting subtle drops in patient aggression, lower burnout rates among nurses who carried the flowers. No one called it supernatural anymore. It had become practical wisdom, the ritual of remembering that care is human first, medical second. In conferences, healthcare leaders cited Evelyn Price as a symbolic pioneer of compassion-centered care. None of them knew she'd ever lived, or that her name had once belonged to a woman who forgot her mother's last wish before spending a lifetime learning how to honor it. Sometimes, during quiet nights in emergency rooms across the country, when exhaustion made the air hum, a nurse or doctor would look up and swear they saw a figure in white pass by, a fleeting shimmer that smelled faintly of lavender. They'd glance again and find no one there, but the patient in the bed would be breathing easier. Whether it was imagination or inheritance didn't matter. The effect was the same. People felt less alone. And so the lavender effect outlived its origin, woven now into thousands of small mercies. Each whispered apology, each steady hand, each moment of forgiveness offered without words. The ledger of karma that had once haunted Evelyn Price was no longer a book of debts, but of balances gently kept. Every kindness left in her wake became another signature on its pages, invisible yet undeniable. Some stories don't end with death or redemption, they just dissolve into the air, carried wherever someone remembers to care. And if you walk late enough through any hospital corridor, when the world outside is asleep and machines breathe for the living, you might notice it too. A trace of lavender, soft and stubborn, reminding you that the work you do still matters, and that somewhere, a nurse who learned the hard way is still keeping watch. The hospital had changed so much that even its ghosts seemed quieter now. The walls gleamed, the lights hummed a sterile white, and everything was run by screens that blinked faster than thought. But deep in the archives, beyond a locked maintenance corridor that no one bothered to clean, there was still one untouched room. What used to be records, it smelled of dust, metal, and faintly of lavender. That's where Maya Grant found the ledger. Maya was a first-year nurse, the kind who still triple-checked every IV drip and apologized to machines when they beeped at her. She'd volunteered for Lavender Hands because she liked the quiet part of care, the sitting still, the listening. On her first week, she was asked to help reorganize old files before they were digitized. The archivist, an older man with shaky hands, told her to toss anything from before 1980. "None of it matters anymore," he'd said. But something in her resisted. Maybe it was the smell that followed her in. Sweet, steady, like someone had left a message in the air. Her ledger was wrapped in linen, yellowed with age, tied with a fraying ribbon. It wasn't labeled officially, just a handwritten tag that read, "Patient Care, Log, Wing C." Inside, the ink had faded, but the names were still legible. Rows and rows of them, each one followed by a brief note. Comforted until dawn, refused morphine, but smiled. Family arrived in time. The writing was precise, yet tender. Halfway through, Maya found a page that stopped her. The heading read, "Personal Entry." Below it, the tone changed, raw, almost confessional. Her name was Margaret Price. She asked only that I stay. I didn't, and I have not slept since. Maya frowned. She knew that name. Price. The hospital's compassion program had been founded under a trust bearing that surname. It was a coincidence too close to ignore. As she read further, the handwriting shifted over the years, the guilt turning into reflection, and then finally, acceptance. The last entry read, "Karma is not punishment. It's an invitation to finish what love began." The final word trailed off, as if written by a hand too tired to keep holding the pen. She brought the ledger to Clara Hastings, now retired, but still haunting the hospital halls like an old tree, rooted but watchful. Clara took one look and went pale. "I thought it was gone," she murmured. "That belonged to Evelyn." She ran her finger over the pages like one might touch a scar. She kept this when she started the Lavender program, said she wanted to turn guilt into guidance. Clara looked up at Maya. "Maybe it's your turn now." That night, Maya couldn't sleep. The smell of lavender followed her home, soft but insistent. Around 2 a.m., she opened the ledger again, the page lights of her phone casting a faint glow. She traced Evelyn's handwriting with her thumb. "An invitation," she whispered, "to finish what love began." She thought about her own mother, a quiet woman living 3 states away, waiting for a call that rarely came. She promised herself she'd call in the morning. The next day, Maya carried the ledger into the staff lounge. She placed it on the table with a small note. "For anyone who has stayed late enough to wonder why we do this." Within a week, it became ritual, each nurse adding a line, a patient story, a small confession, a moment of grace. It was no longer a record of care, but a living ledger of karma, renewed each night by those who understood what Evelyn once learned too late, that staying is its own form of salvation. When Maya was promoted a year later, she found a sprig of dried lavender tucked inside her locker. tied with the same fraying ribbon the ledger had been wrapped in. No note this time. None was needed. The scent lingered. It began, as most quiet revolutions do, without anyone naming it. A mother in Detroit started sitting beside her neighbor's ailing father after hearing about lavender hands from her niece, a nurse who had trained under Maya Grant. A teacher in Kansas City lit a small lavender candle each morning before class, saying it helped her remember patience. A hospice volunteer in Oregon began carrying a pocket notebook she called her ledger, where she wrote one act of kindness at the end of every shift, not the ones she gave, but the ones she received. No one coordinated it, no central committee. It just spread, the way scents do when the wind knows where to go. Hospitals started noticing something strange. In towns where Lavender Hands volunteers had worked, ER violence rates dropped, staff retention rose, and patients described feeling known instead of just treated. Sociologists tried to analyze it, but compassion doesn't plot neatly on charts. What they missed was that karma, in its truest form, had slipped back into daily life, not as superstition, but as reciprocity. People simply began staying for each other. Maya, now in her 30s, found herself speaking at a national conference about the future of caregiving. Her slides were clean, her data solid, but what caught the audience wasn't the numbers. It was the lavender sprig she laid on the podium. "This isn't policy," she said. "It's presence. We're just continuing someone's unfinished apology." The crowd fell silent in that way people do when they realize something sacred has just passed through the room. Afterward, an old man approached her. He wore a suit too neat for his trembling hands. "I was a patient once," he said softly. "A nurse sat by me all night, never spoke a word. I think, I think she smelled like that." He gestured toward the lavender. Maya didn't tell him that the hospital records from that year listed no such shift nurse. She just nodded, as if acknowledging both of their ghosts. The movement began to take root outside of medicine. A group of social workers formed Lavender Bridges, a community program for families who'd lost connection between siblings, between parents, and children. Their motto, "Stay even when leaving is easier." In one small town in Maine, a former inmate started a gardening initiative at a halfway house. He told the local paper he was inspired by a story about a nurse who made peace with her past. He'd never read the story. He'd heard it told by a janitor who'd heard it from a nurse who'd worked under Maya. The line of telling was as tangled as fate itself. By the 10th year of Lavender Hands, the ledger Evelyn Price once kept had become a relic. Maya placed it in a glass case in the hospital's new museum wing. The plaque beneath it read, "The Nurse Who Stayed." Visitors often leaned close, claiming they could smell faint lavender through the glass. Security guards laughed it off until they started smelling it too. When Maya finally retired, she returned to that same room where the ledger first found her. The air was still sweet. She sat for a long time, remembering the first time she touched those faded pages and the woman whose story she'd carried unknowingly. Before leaving, she wrote one last entry in a small notebook she kept for herself. "Love doesn't vanish. It multiplies quietly, like scent in the air. You can't own it, only pass it on." As she closed the book, a soft hum rose in the corner of the room, the same lullaby Evelyn had once used to calm her patients. It was so faint that Maya almost doubted it. But when she turned to leave, the smell followed her into the hallway, gentle and stubborn. Somewhere in another hospital, a nurse lifted her head, sensing lavender where none should be. She smiled without knowing why, placed her hand on a dying patient's shoulder, and stayed. Miles Garrison wasn't the kind of man who believed in soft things. He was a contractor, hands like bark, talk straight as rebar, patience long gone since the divorce. He lived alone in a half-renovated house on the edge of town, surrounded by unfinished work and the noise of his own thoughts. On the morning it began, a letter arrived by mistake. It was addressed to a Lavender Hands volunteer, local chapter. No name, no return address. He tossed it aside with the junk mail, but that night, after a storm cut the power, he found himself lighting a candle. And there it was again, that same letter on the counter. The edge singed slightly as if touched by flame. Curiosity won. He opened it. Inside was a single sentence written in careful cursive. Someone nearby could use a hand staying. No signature, no instructions. He should have laughed, thrown it away, but something about that phrasing tugged at him. Staying. Not helping, not saving. Staying. He went to bed with that word looping through his head, like a loose screw rattling in a pipe. 2 nights later, while fixing the porch railing, he noticed his new neighbor, an older woman in a wheelchair, trying to drag her trash bins down the drive. She was stubborn, refusing help from anyone. Miles hesitated, that usual calculation flickering. Not my problem. But the candlelight memory and that strange sentence pushed through. He crossed the yard, wordless, lifted the bins to the curb, and left before she could argue. The next morning there was a sprig of lavender stuck in his fence post. He almost cursed at it, as if someone was playing a joke. Still, he didn't throw it away. Days turned into a quiet pattern. He started checking on the woman, whose name was Ethel. She lived alone, arthritis eating her hands, a small oxygen tank by her chair. She never thanked him outright, but she began leaving things on his porch. Fresh bread, a cup of tea in a thermos, one time a folded note that read, "You remind me of someone who finally stayed." The scent of lavender always followed the paper. When Ethel passed away that winter, Miles attended her small funeral. Only 3 people came. The hospice nurse thanked him for helping. She mentioned Ethel had been one of the first Lavender Hands patients in the county. She said her nurse used to sing a lullaby that smelled like lavender, the nurse told him softly. Said it was how she learned to forgive. After the service, Miles went home, sat in his unfinished kitchen, and cried for a woman he'd barely known. A week later, a package arrived on his doorstep. Inside, a small, worn notebook tied with a violet ribbon. On the first page, a message. The work continues where kindness lingers. The next pages were blank. He didn't know what to do with it at first, so he left it on his table. Then one night, after helping a stranded driver fix her tire, he came home and wrote in the notebook, stayed with her until the engine started. He didn't mean to, but the words came easy. It became his ritual. 1 line each night, nothing grand, just proof he'd remained present somewhere the world could have gone cold. Months later, other people began adding to the notebook. His sister, his crewman, a teenager he'd hired for summer work. It passed from hand to hand, name to name, until no one remembered whose it had been first. The scent of lavender clung to the pages as if inked into the fibers. By the time Miles died, decades later, his small town had its own Lavender Hands chapter, meeting once a month in the community hall. They called their local outreach the Garrison Ledger. The motto hung over the door, "Stay, even when leaving is easier." Some debts are paid not with apology, but with presence. Karma, it seemed, didn't keep score. It just waited for someone to notice the ledger had room for one more good line. By the time Lily Garrison was old enough to know what karma meant, the world had forgotten how to sit still. Everything was streamed, scheduled, optimized. Her phone tracked her pulse, her sleep, her smiles. The only thing it couldn't measure was peace. And that's what she craved most. She worked at a tech startup in Austin, designing empathy algorithms for customer support bots. Irony didn't escape her. Every day she coded a machine to sound human while she herself felt less so. One afternoon, while clearing her father's storage unit after his passing, she found the notebook, the Garrison Ledger. It was tucked inside an old cigar box, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly floral. Even after all the years, inside the pages were yellowed, soft from handling. She saw her father's handwriting, blocky, practical, and lines from others she didn't recognize. Short entries, small mercies, stayed with the neighbor's dog till she came home. Listened to a kid cry on the bus without pulling away. Sat through my brother's silence. Lily traced her fingers over them like braille. Something in her chest shifted, an ache that felt like remembering who she'd been before ambition hardened her. That night she dreamt of a hospital hallway lit by golden light, filled with the smell of lavender. A woman in white walked ahead of her, never turning back, only humming. When Lily woke, she couldn't shake it. She looked up Lavender Hands online. Barely any mentions now. The website had gone dark years ago, but the few archived photos showed what her father must have believed in. People sitting beside others, doing nothing heroic except staying. It gnawed at her for days. She started taking longer routes home, walking through neighborhoods she never noticed before. One evening, she saw a man collapse near a bus stop. Others walked around him, eyes locked on their phones. Lily hesitated, then knelt. He wasn't hurt, just dizzy, dehydrated. She stayed with him until the ambulance came. When they left, she realized her hands smelled faintly sweet, though she hadn't touched anything but the man's shoulder. Back home, she opened the ledger and wrote, "Stayed." Just one word. But the room seemed to exhale. The lavender scent deepened. She stared at the page, unsure if she was imagining it. Then she laughed quietly, half disbelief, half recognition. "All right," she said into the empty room. "I get it." Within months, Lily had started something small, a digital version of the old lavender ledger. It wasn't viral, not loud enough for that, but it grew in quiet corners of the internet. People posted short confessions of decency, didn't hang up when Dad repeated the same story again. Paid attention, stayed. The world, even in its noise, still had room for stillness. Sometimes, while working late, Lily swore she could smell lavender drifting through her apartment, even though she owned no candles, no flowers. She never mentioned it. Some inheritances don't need explaining. She just kept writing, line by line, teaching machines empathy by practicing it herself. The future was loud, yes, but beneath the static, karma still whispered in its native tongue. Patience, presence, care. And Lily listened. It happened quietly, the way true endings do. Lily Garrison was invited to speak at a healthcare innovation summit, a last-minute replacement for some corporate executive who'd dropped out. The topic was human connection in the age of automation. She planned to talk about her empathy AI project, maybe mention the digital lavender ledger if time allowed. But as she stepped on stage, the teleprompter flickered and something in her gut told her to close the laptop. She looked out over the sea of faces and said, almost without thinking, "My father once kept a notebook filled with small kindnesses. He called it a ledger. It started because of a woman who stayed when others left." The audience fell still. Lily spoke for 20 minutes straight. No slides, no data, just the story as she knew it. The nurse who had once forgotten to stay. The guilt that became grace. The lavender scent that never quite left. She told them how compassion had survived in the margins of ledgers and memory, how presence had passed from one hand to another until it reached her own. When she finished, no one clapped at first. They just sat there, breathing together in the quiet. Then slowly, the applause began, steady, human, not the performative kind. Afterward, an older man approached her. He introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Lee, head of archives at the National Medical Museum. He held up his tablet, showing her a photograph of an old hospital record. "You might want to see this," he said. The image was of a faded plaque, "For those who stayed." Beneath it, barely visible, was a signature, E. Price, RN. He explained that the museum had recently received a donation, a bound journal discovered behind a demolished hospital wall during renovation. Inside were entries from a nurse named Evelyn Price, including one that read, "If kindness outlives me, let it find its own name." Lily's throat tightened. She asked to see the journal in person. Weeks later, standing before the glass case, she pressed her hand to it. The lavender scent was faint but unmistakable. She smiled through tears. The ledger had never really ended. It had just kept moving, from page to page, name to name, life to life. That night she returned home and wrote one final entry in her father's old book. Evelyn Price stayed. Then she closed the cover and placed it on her windowsill. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Fast, loud, indifferent. But for a moment she could almost hear the hum of that old lullaby, the one that had carried through hospital corridors and across generations. The air seemed to pulse softly, alive with something unseen yet certain. And somewhere, maybe in the space between heartbeats, maybe in the long quiet between one life and the next, a nurse in white smiled, not as a ghost, but as an echo fulfilled. Her ledger at last balanced. The lavender scent lingered just a little longer before fading into the night.